2306 is probably the most popular size of mini quad motor made today. And there's a reason for that. It's very good for the kind of 5-inch, 6-inch props that mini quads are spinning. But 2207 is getting more and more popular, and that leads me to wonder. These two motor sizes, they're very similar in terms of size and weight. Just one is narrower and taller, and one is wider and flatter, and so what's the difference? Why would you pick a 2207 versus a 2306 motor? That is what we're going to talk about today. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and this is FPV Know-It-All, where you learn everything you need to know to get your quadcopter in the air, keep it flying its best, and enjoy the great hobby of FPV. Here's what we're doing today. I have taken this quadcopter and I have put two different sets of motors on it. I put some 2306 motors on it and some 2207 motors on it, and I flew it, and I'm going to compare the motors on the bench, on paper, and how they fly in the air. Now, in order to make this experiment as valid as possible, the motors need to be as similar as possible. You take any random 2207 motor and some other random 2306, and really you could get any results because there are so many factors that affect a motor's performance. The way the windings are made, the way the stator is made, the magnet strength for sure. So I wanted to get two motors that were as similar as possible, and that's why I settled on the RCX NK series of motors. Now, I've been a fan of RCX since way back when I was just getting into the hobby. I was struggling to pay $18, $20 a pop for the Sunny Sky motors that were very popular back then. And RCX was suggested to me as a budget option, and they still make reasonably priced, good performing, reasonably durable motors. I think they're a really good value for the money. The specific motors that we're talking about today are the RCX NK2306 2400 kV and the NK2207 2400 kV. Identical construction, just with different sizes. And if you look, you can see they're only $18, which you may be thinking, well, I thought you said these were a budget option. But the trick with RCX motors is that instead of getting the standard factory warranty, you choose no warranty and support. It knocks $3 off, and that brings these motors down to $14.99, $15 more or less, which I think is not the cheapest motor you can find, but given the performance of the motor, it makes it a pretty good value. So that's what you do there. If we take a look at the specs for the motors, the first thing I want to show you is the weight. And by the way, many people look at these motors and they say, what, 50 grams? No. I don't know why RCX does. They've always done that. They just list the weight of the motor at 50 grams. I think it's the shipping weight. The actual weight of the motors is down here in the specifications. And let's just take a quick look at that. The 2207 motors weighs 35 grams. And the 2306 motor weighs 33 grams. So the 2306 motor is slightly lighter. So the weight of these motors is really not that different. One's 2 grams lighter or 8 grams over the total weight of a quad, but that's just not that much. It's more interesting, I think, to compare the stator volume. So if we calculate the volume of both of these motors, we get 23 squared times the height is 6 times 3.14 is that many cubic millimeters for the 2306, and for the 2207 we get 22 squared times 7 times 3.14 equals 10,638. And this is interesting because we can see that the 2207 is a slightly larger motor. 10,638 cubic millimeters versus 9,966. And just for fun, let's see what percent that is. 10,638 out of 9,966.36 is about 7% bigger. And just out of curiosity, how does the weight compare? 35 out of 33. Yeah, so it is their density is almost identical. The 2207 is about 7% heavier, and it's got about a 7% bigger volume. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to compare these motors on the thrust stand. And thrust stand results don't perfectly reflect the real world, but they are a useful way of comparing two motors. And what is very interesting, what you see is that at 100% throttle, the motors are equal in terms of efficiency, 2.04 grams per watt for both of them. But the 2207 makes more thrust, about 50 grams more thrust, 1,797 grams versus 1,745 grams for the 2306. However, at 50% throttle, the 2207 is making more thrust, 817 versus 764 grams, but it is less efficient. The 2207 is only 3.14 grams per watt, whereas the 2306 is 3.25 grams per watt. What we see is that the 2207 always makes more thrust on any given prop at any given throttle position, all else being equal. Sometimes the 2207 is more efficient, and sometimes the 2306 is more efficient. And it actually doesn't seem to be a trend about whether one is more efficient at low throttle. It really just seems to go back and forth depending on various factors. But the 2207 is always making a little bit more thrust and generally is drawing a little bit more amps. And that's really consistent with how what I observed when I flew them. So let's take a look at some flight videos, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about what the experience of flying them was like. As we go into the flight videos, I want to acknowledge that a lot of people are not going to see any meaningful difference between them, and I'm going to show you the video anyway because science. But if you don't see much of a difference, don't worry. I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you my thoughts after we watch the videos. Well, I don't know if you guys could tell a difference, but I got to tell you, I felt a big, big difference, and I absolutely, no question, preferred the 2207 motors. And I actually am going to have a hard time telling you why and what the difference was. Like, I would love to put these motors on a thrust stand and measure things like transition times, to measure like torque down low versus up high and RPM, but the bottom line for me is that when I put the 2207s on, I just loved the way the quad flew. It flew like I like a quad to fly. And maybe this is why, if you ask somebody like Johnny FPV how he likes his quads to fly, and he'll say juicy, and I'm like, that's not scientific. Tell me what does juicy even mean? That's nothing. But maybe I kind of get it, because if you ask me why this quad, what was about the quad that I liked better, I don't know. It was juicy. Some of it has to be attributed to the fact that the 2207 motors make more thrust. That's just a fact. But they don't make like a massive amount more thrust. They make like 40 or 50 grams out of 700 or 800 grams on the bench. And that just doesn't seem to me like that's enough to make the night and day difference that I felt. So I have to wonder if the difference goes back to something like the throttle curve. Traditionally, 2306 motors, wider motors, are said to have more torque but less top end, and taller motors are said to have more top end but less torque. I think that there's a difference in the way that the motor sort of spools up. It feels like the 2207 motors are more like poppy, like when you go woo, whoosh on the throttle, like they kind of pop more, whereas the 2306s feel like they are a little more, I can't tell if they're a little more linear. The 2207s kind of go zoop, whereas the 2306s kind of go zoop. I can't tell if they're a little more linear or if maybe they just are a little bit less overall. But the bottom line is that there's no question which I prefer is the 2207, absolutely. And I'm a little bit disappointed to have to tell you that, because I really want to like give you some scientific stuff. I just don't have the equipment. I need a real test stand. But then you go, oh, well, but the motors, that doesn't tell you what they're like in the air. But in the air, you can't get hard scientific data. Other things that I did to try to get hard scientific data is I didn't retune the quad. I actually have a tuning video I did on the 2306s. You can see how they tuned up. I didn't retune the quad at all or set it back to defaults because I wanted to see how the 2207s behaved. And they behaved very similarly in terms of the tune. The biggest thing I didn't like about the 2306s was that they seemed a little bit noisy, by which I mean they were a little bit prone to vibration. I wasn't able to raise D gains as high as I normally would like to, or remove filtering as much as I normally would like to, because the 2306 is starting to get hot. And I had an issue where the quadcopter was kind of twitching. As it hovered, it would kind of go these little twitches, and that's a sign of noise. I tried various things to fix it, like adding a capacitor to the quadcopter and soft mounting the flight controller and etc. None of it fixed it, and I kind of hoped that putting the 2207s on would fix it. And I will say that with the 2207s, it got slightly better, but it wasn't gone entirely. And I kind of wonder if maybe the ESCs, these are the BLHeli Wraith ESCs, I kind of wonder if the ESCs are to blame. But that's a separate issue. That was not related to either the 2306 or the 2207s. Yeah. So I like the 2207s better. It feels to me like they were poppier or punchier in their response to the throttle, and probably they made more thrust overall. Since they had lower efficiency on many of the bench tests, you might expect I had higher amp draw and lower flight times. And if I jammed the throttle, like just 100% throttle and just, let the quad climb, the 2207s did draw a little bit more amps. The 2306s were at like 115, 120 amps, and the 2207s were closer to like 130 amps until the battery sagged, and then just everything went down. But so the 2207s drew a little bit more amps, but I actually got slightly longer flight times off the 2207s, which is the opposite of what you'd expect. I don't know. I mean, obviously, again, I'm just flying. I was trying to be a little scientific in that I had a particular song that I was trying to do a freestyle edit to, and I basically flew the song starting from the same, flying to the music to try and give me a little bit of consistency. And the 2207s pretty consistently got a little bit further into the song before the battery crapped out and I had to land and come down again. So maybe the fact that they were a little bit punchier meant I was working them a little bit less hard. I don't know. That is going to do it, though, for this video in which we have completely and once and for all answered the question of which is better, 2207 versus 2306. Now, obviously, which of those you're going to prefer depends a lot on, well, number one, it depends on your flight style. I know that I like a very dynamic freestyle flight style where, like, if you think of pilots like Tommy, oh my God, he has a very smooth flight style. It's not as sort of poppy, punchy, dynamic, right? That's just the way he flies. I have a very dynamic flight style. I like to be bumping the throttle and bouncing the quad around like that, and to do that I need a motor that responds very quickly, and the 2207 seem to give me that. If you have a different flight style, you might like the 2306 though, and obviously as we get into props, the 2306 might do better with like a heavier prop. There's various stuff there, but I'm happy to finally deliver it on this video. I first teased this experiment months ago, and I've actually had this footage sitting on my desk, on my hard drive rather, for weeks, just not getting around to doing it because, well, to be honest with you, because I really wanted to give you a more scientific, more rigorous answer, and I didn't know how to get it. And finally, I just said, all right, well, I just got to give them the subjective answer, and that's what I'm doing. Thank you so much to RCX, my Myrcmart, for sending me these motors to test. I still feel that at a price of $15, these motors are a really good value. There's some other value motors that are out there that are coming in the $8 or $9 range, and I'm really suspicious of the quality of those motors and the durability. It feels like even if they're generally good, they're more likely to get a dud, whereas these guys have always been pretty good to me. I know that some of you might hesitate to select the no warranty option to get the price down to $15, but are you going to really send a bad motor back to China to get the warranty anyway? No, clearly not. So in general, the quality is pretty good, and I just, buy 5 of them, and if one of them's bad, well, hey, you probably still came out ahead. That's my philosophy. Going forward, I'm going to be a lot more interested in 2207. Back when I started getting into quads, 2204, 2205 was the pretty standard size that most people were flying, even 2203. That's how old I am. And 2207 was this monster size that only crazy people ran. But And I think some of that stigma is kind of held, but it's just not true. 2207 actually could be a new, really good general purpose size. Maybe a little bit less generally applicable than 2306. I think 2306 is going to be a little friendlier to people, but for the way I fly, I really feel like 2207 hit the spot here, and I'm really curious to try other 2207 motors that are out there. That's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave your questions down in the comments. Leave your experience. What do you think about 2306 versus 2207? Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. Happy flying.